the status of globally active outfront cities within the U.S. federal system. The relationship of cities to global governance entities has been problematic for some time. The UN system, and in fact even the notion of treaties, assumes that the nation-state is the representative of the population on the international stage, of the population of the nation. But increasingly, as cities accrue greater power, greater responsibility to operate globally as economic entities, there's pressure on that assumption. And the United Nations has started to respond with a study group set up several years ago to examine the issue. Resulting from that were recommendations that nations should consult with subnational governments, local state governments, as they prepare reports for UN bodies. And we heard earlier from Joanne that is starting to happen in the U.S. So as the U.S. prepares reports for treaty monitoring bodies, they do send out requests for information to states and localities that they can incorporate into reports, and increasingly started including some of those entities in the actual delegation. In addition, UN bodies like UNESCO, and especially Habitat, are routinely reaching out to ensure that cities are represented as these international bodies grapple with local challenges. But these measures remain ad hoc. There's no clarity over the formal role of cities in world governance. And indeed, it's this lack of clarity that creates space for the creation of the Global Parliament of Mayors, the entity that Benjamin Barber founded recently. In their concluding statement of action, the Global Parliament of Mayors, GPM, indicated that it will work with and advise international organizations like the World Bank and especially the United Nations, underscoring that it has just an informal role. The informal role that cities and even this organized parliament still continue to play within the world governance hierarchy. They're there to advise and help to put in their 2 cents, but there's no formal way that they have input. Other organizations that are involved in this way are United Cities and Local Governments, which has consultative status at the United Nations, but is a collection of local subnational governments. The Committee on Social Inclusion, Participatory Democracy, and Human Rights, the Global Charter Agenda on the Human Right to the City. All of these just weigh in but have no formal role internationally. And interestingly, the Global Charter Agenda has more than 350 cities active nationwide, but I looked at their map online of cities that were members and were active, and there was not a single U.S. city that was part of that. So part of this may be the U.S. exceptionalism, as well as the fact that cities themselves have difficulty actually gaining power in this type of setting. This lack of clarity is accentuated within the U.S. federal system, especially when cities take human rights positions that differ from those of the national government, and that may be something that we'll see more of in the coming 4 years. And in fact, when studying this issue, the UN put it back on nation states. According to their statement, the statement of the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee that was looking at the local governments, the problem is an internal one for nations. They said the problem arises when laws regarding the competence sharing between central government and local government are not accessible and clear, when it's unclear internally who's got responsible for what level of governance. They recommend a clear-cut division of powers between the different tiers of government, and then it must be understood that every level has a human rights responsibility, but the UN really just wants to hear from the nations, the nation state. So how far can the U.S. cities go? How far should they be able to go to implement human rights under our federal system? And the answer is not completely clear. It's murky. So, for example, San Francisco has adopted the Women's Rights Convention, CEDAW, as its municipal law, and we just heard that Pittsburgh has done something similar now. So hopefully this will be a trend. And they've done that even though the United States has failed to ratify the convention. Further, representatives of the San Francisco Commission on the Status of Women, who implement the Women's Rights Convention at the local level, have informally reported on the city's implementation of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Do these city officials run afoul of the U.S. Constitution, which permits only the national government to enter into a treaty and represent the nation on the world stage? Further, do cities and states tread on the federal elected branch's foreign affairs prerogatives when they establish independent policies with regard to the UN or its branches, as the Supreme Court's decision in Crosby versus National Foreign Trade Council suggests? companies doing business in Burma on human rights grounds. So Massachusetts had adopted this law, and the Supreme Court struck it down, saying Massachusetts could not do that because of the confusion it would create. That it would compromise the capacity of the president to speak for the nation with one voice in dealing with foreign governments. In contrast, when President Bush, the second President Bush, tried to enforce the Vienna Convention on Consular Affairs, ratified by the U.S., he was trying to enforce it in Texas, trying to get Texas to abide by it. Texas objected, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the objection. In that case, arose when the state of Texas denied Jose Medellin, a Mexican national on death row, his right to contact his consulate in order to get representation as he was going through the criminal process. The Vienna Convention on Consular Affairs would have required that, and the U.S. had ratified it, as Texas ignored that. Seeming to bypass the plain meaning of the Supremacy Clause, the Supreme Court in Medellin, Texas, ruled that, quote, while a treaty may constitute an international commitment, it is not binding domestic law unless Congress has enacted statutes implementing it where the treaty itself conveys an intention to be self-executing and is ratified on that basis. So in other words, the signature of the national government on this treaty didn't have any impact on Texas without further action by the national government, by the federal government. Together, the Massachusetts Burma case and the Medellin case suggest this untenable position that some national governments cannot implement human rights norms when the federal government has taken no action on the norms and is silent. It's just CDOG, right? But when the federal government has spoken to endorse the human rights norms, some national governments are free to violate them unless the national government does something more to implement. So certainly this issue of hierarchy is a central challenge facing sanctuary cities. And Professor Rosenblum alluded to that, or mentioned that earlier. As these cities carve out positions on immigration that respond to local needs and politics, but that differ perhaps dramatically from federal positions. What is the Supremacy Clause going to say about that? There's also a lurking issue in the human rights cities movement. The tension between national and local authority to address human rights issues has surfaced in Europe as well, and was made clear in the Graz Declaration on Implementation of Human Rights issued in 2015. The statement concludes that the point of time has come in which it's indispensable to respond to the threats to human rights and fundamental freedoms by cooperation between authorities at all levels. And they urge a common strategy to enhance inclusion. So in Europe, as in the U.S., there's a perception that national governments stand on extreme principles and are not available to collaborate with cities, and leaving cities without sufficient power to deal with realities on the ground. And the case of refugee influx is the case in point of that. But despite national resistance, cities continue to accrue power through their constituencies, right? They've got people in the cities. And this is a train that will not stop. In a recent article in Foreign Affairs, Rodrigo Tavares, who's a United Nations University fellow, noted that, quote, the international activism of cities and states is rapidly growing across the world, discreetly transforming diplomatic practices and delivery of public services. In short, the international governance structure in place no longer responds adequately to human needs and capacities. And this is a classic design challenge. To allow for local implementation of human rights, to better facilitate that, to better support that, we need to begin redesigning the hierarchical relationships between cities and international bodies, and in the United States, at least, between cities and the national government. So perhaps it's time to explore a more formal status for cities and international governance. Perhaps statute or case law could clarify the role of cities in implementing human rights norms domestically. In some countries, this is a matter of constitutional law, the idea that there's local capacity to implement these. At the very least, scholars in the United States might explore a more nuanced, one-way ratchet approach that allows local governments to get ahead of the federal government in human rights implementation, to adopt CDOG, to adopt the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, but doesn't allow them to fall behind. An approach that would permit the CDOG ratification, but not Texas's derogation from the Vienna Convention. So let me turn to the second design